Hey, I'm Nick, and in this video I talk with Tiffany Deluccia of the Unstuck Group. And the Unstuck Group is probably my favorite organization that works with churches and helps them get unstuck, as the name describes. And Tiffany leads their sales and marketing, and I just think they do a great job of that with content marketing, serving churches, and then helping them take steps to get their church unstuck. And in the same way, we can learn from them about how we can help people in our church take steps and how we can use content to reach them and help them take steps in their faith. So we talk about a digital ministry strategy. We talk about the two types of online engagement that Tiffany sees, but that churches actually neglect the one and we kind of only speak to the other. And we have to be careful so that we speak to both in the appropriate way. We talk about staffing it, like what does that look like? Should that person sit at the leadership team level of a church? So we talk about all that and more in this interview. And this is one of many videos that are part of a series of videos all about online and digital church strategy. It's bonus content for the New Digital Church course. Check out newdigitalchurch.com if you're interested in that, and hit that like button if this video is helpful to you. Hey, I'm Nick, and I'm here with Tiffany. Welcome, Tiffany.
Hi there.
So introduce us to yourself and tell us about Unstuck Group and the work you do there.
Sure. I'm Tiffany Deluccia. I head up sales and marketing at the Unstuck Group, and we help churches get unstuck. We've been doing that for about 10 years, founded by Tony Morgan, and we have historically really helped churches clarify where they believe God's called them to go and how they're going to get there. And we've done that through facilitated planning processes. And now we're leaning into even more leadership coaching options to help pastors, especially in a season like this, where they just sometimes need, just somebody walking with them through the challenges they're facing. So that's what we do.
Yeah, and you do a great job at it. I make no bones about the fact that I think the Unstuck Group is my favorite group that works with churches and helps church leaders. And you do that, like you said, with specific processes where people can engage with you and work long-term, either in person or now virtual. But you also create a ton of helpful content. And that's going to be a little bit of what we talk about in this interview, because I want to help churches think the same way. Like, how can we not just do what we always have done, but maybe create content and make connections online and leverage online in a way that will reach more people, help them take steps toward Jesus long before they ever show up, watching a service online or in person at a church or something like that. And we're recording this, and 2020, pretty much every church moved online, almost all of them in some form or fashion. But that doesn't mean that they did that. I mean, most of us, it was like, what do we got to do this week? Okay, what's next? How do we make this work? How do we fix that broken thing? There wasn't like a strategy to it. And even now, 6 months later, I would say there probably isn't still a strategy to it for most churches. So if you were on staff at a church right now and doing what you do at Unstuck, where would you start? Like, what would you do?
Yeah, I actually got that question a lot of times about 3 or 4 months ago when everybody was moving online. And I had several different churches contact me and just say, hey, could I pick your brain on how do we move our ministry online? And the biggest issue I had with that was I just on the call say, I don't know your church. I don't work there. I don't know what you're about. That's the thing with content marketing, is you've got to go back to the very foundation of what you do to develop a strategy that's going to work. And I started my career at a PR agency, a digital communications agency. And when I think back to that time, it was back when businesses were first trying to figure out content marketing. And so it's kind of funny. I'm like getting the second wave all these years later of businesses back then were saying, okay, we think we need a blog. Like, we think we need social media. And it was these two different categories. Over here, these are these digital things that we think we need to add on. And over here, this is the business we've always had. And we would have to help them strip back and say, no. You're not going to have a digital strategy and a business strategy. You're going to have an integrated plan that these digital things over here should always be driving the goals that you have for the business. And I think in a lot of ways, that's where churches need to step back right now and say, it's not that we need to just throw up our service online. We need to add another social media channel. You need to go back to your foundation of your ministry strategy. Who are we trying to reach? What's our vision? What has God called us to do? What's God called us to do in the city that we're in, or the multiple locations that we're in? And how does digital facilitate that? How does it drive towards the goals that we have? And that's not really where I saw most churches starting a few months ago, and which makes perfect sense because most of them don't have a marketing department or a team in place to do that. But that's where I would start. I'd go back to, if you go back to those foundational conversations you've probably had through the years, what's our mission? What's our vision? Who are we trying to reach? What are our primary methods for reaching them? You're going to find that it's probably in those methods where you're going to say something's different, something's changed. We need to be using digital there, but some things haven't changed. Who you're trying to reach probably hasn't changed. And so I think that's where I would start. I go back to those foundational mission, vision, strategy questions, and then figure out where content and marketing fits in.
Yeah, and how digital works. Because I think you're probably right in that in some ways churches just replicated the in-person online. Obviously you can't really do that, but as best they could. It's like, oh, take this service that looked like that, put that online. That's a whole other conversation. You all have talked about that on the podcast, how that's not exactly a great move either, because the way you watch online isn't the same as you engage in person. But there's that sense of like, let's create this other digital plan and then add that on. But what you're saying is no, let's go back to the core plan, the core strategy, and talk about where digital fits in with that probably naturally, right?
Right. Yeah. The thing I kept coming down to as I had those different conversations with pastors was you don't need a digital marketing strategy and a ministry strategy. It's all going to be the same thing. Like the digital tools are just going to be part of the toolbox of your ministry strategy. Now, I mean, there's the added complication that a lot of churches probably aren't super clear on their ministry strategy to begin with, which is why I say you still have to go back to that level, because nothing you do online is going to make a lick of sense if it's not connected to what you're trying to do overall as a church.
Sure. And that, you're right. I mean, that's probably, I don't know, 8, 9 out of 10 people watching this, their church could probably just start with, let's talk about ministry strategy and figure that out. But let's say they did, and they were pretty clear on that, clear enough. Let's talk content marketing. You mentioned that phrase. What to you, like, what is content marketing, and what would an effective content marketing strategy look like in a church?
Sure. Content marketing and inbound marketing is an interchangeable term there. It's just the idea that you're going to attract people to your church or your organization by providing helpful content that's designed to nudge them along a journey, versus the old school marketing tactics where it was just push out your message every way possible, hit people with billboards and hit people with ads. This is a much more, it's an attractional, it's a serving posture way to connect with new people. I think from a ministry standpoint, it just makes so much sense, because you can approach it very much with this mindset of, how can we serve the people that we're trying to reach? How can we be helpful to them? How can we provide them with something useful? But within that, you're also getting really clear on who is it for, and you're tailoring that message. So when I think about content marketing, I think about, just to give a practical example, if you're trying to reach, young moms in the city where you're in, the content that you're going to create to try to attract them to your church is totally different than if you're trying to reach single millennials or college students. So content marketing has just built in this nuanced layer of really knowing who you're speaking to and thinking through how you serve them and how you attract them. And then the whole goal is that you're nudging them towards a big step, or maybe a small step first and then a little bigger step. And with churches, I think historically we've thought of showing up to the Sunday morning service is the primary first thing. I mean, when we think about, we used to always just tell people, invite your friends to church, invite your friends to church. Right now, nobody's doing that. Even the people who may be back in person, they're probably not inviting their friends to come with them. Content marketing is another way you can actually equip your people you're giving them content they can share to help them attract the people that they know towards what you're doing as a church as well. So the whole strategy is to be helpful along the way, to provide content. And when I say content, that word is so ubiquitous and can mean a million different things. It could be a podcast series. It could be a YouTube channel. It could be blog posts that you write. The type of content you create needs to align with who you're trying to reach and how they like to consume content, but the goal is that you're trying to meet their needs and lead them towards connecting with your church, and whatever your first step is towards meeting Christ and taking steps towards following him.
Let's talk about like an example, and we could use an example maybe from Unstuck Group and just relate that to church, or maybe you'll think of something that like a church would do. But you guys do this really well. I mean, you create content that serves the church. If it helps them take steps towards working with you in a bigger way, great. If not, it also helps them, right? Like you're serving
Right.
them in that way. So what would be an example of like how this could work? And then how do you measure it? That's the other thing. Because that's the thing I think a lot of churches wonder too, is with older style methods of reaching out, at least there was something you knew. They walked through the door, you could count them there. Online, it gets a little weird. Views, clicks, the numbers aren't the same. You might get 30,000 impression and 400 people clicked on it. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it's hard with measuring it, I think. But what's an example, and like, how do you measure it?
Sure. Yeah. Before I get into an example, let me just say my take on measurement and metrics when you're online is that you still need to start with measuring what your ultimate goal is and back up from there. So measuring like 1 second views of a video on Facebook, it just doesn't serve you very well. It doesn't tell you. I was joking when everybody was debating, should we be counting 1 second views or 3 second views back in April? I just kept thinking, okay, so the 1 second views or 3 second views, that's people who stopped, thought, this might interest me. And then went, nah, and just kept scrolling. I mean, like, it's not telling you a whole lot except that people weren't compelled to stay engaged. So my take on metrics is that you still need to start with what are the steps you want people to take, and you back up from there. So for an example, for us at the Unstuck Group, we obviously want to be talking on the phone with pastors who might need what we do, that we could serve, that somebody that we could serve really, really well. So for us, that getting somebody to raise their hand and say, I'd like to talk to you. That's a big goal. That's a big step for us. So when we're working backwards from there, we're trying to say, how do we help somebody go from having never heard of us to being willing to talk on the phone with a member of our team and say, maybe you could help our church. So it can start with, they see a post on Facebook directing them to a podcast episode. We've designed the podcast episodes to really hit felt needs of pastors. We want to make sure that we're talking about things that help you address real practical everyday ministry challenges. From there, we've offered a step to subscribe via email to the podcast. We'd love for you to subscribe on your phone, from your podcast device, but that doesn't tell us anything. We can look at the number of downloads on the podcast. It gives us some idea that people are listening, but people who say, hey, send me the show notes via email every week. Now they're not anonymous anymore. That's a big step when I think about our path with content marketing. So they can tune in anonymous on Facebook. They can tune in anonymously on the listening to the podcast. When they say, hey, I'm not anonymous anymore, I want what you've got, that's a big step. From there, we may be encouraging them to take a free online assessment that we have, or to tune into a different particular series. And we're learning more and more about people as they go with the information they tell us, what they're interested in, what they've engaged with. And then we're pointing them towards that next step that we have along the way. Is that answering your question a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. Do you measure a bunch of things in it? Because like you were saying, don't measure all these vanity type things.
Yeah.
Like you said, the 3 second could be actually a negative thing because you watched it and you said, this isn't good.
Right.
Like at Unstuck Group, do you mostly just look at the one number? Do you measure like 4 or 5 along the way, like each step along the way? What does that look like?
Yeah, to me, I'm always thinking about first steps and next steps. So I want to know that we are engaging more people on a first step. Things that tell you, overall website traffic, overall engagement with podcast downloads, overall growth of a social media following. That's just sort of big picture, but that doesn't tell us enough. That's going to tell us we're doing something that's connecting. We could have those numbers be really strong. And if no one is ever getting to that point where they stop being anonymous, or no one's ever getting to that point where they jump on a call, those first metrics don't matter. So yeah, we're measuring lots of different things, but you have to look at them in the progression of what's the journey you're trying to help people take. So we'll look at those big picture metrics, and then we're going to be looking at how many, how many new people are connecting. They stop being anonymous. How many new people are raising their hand? How many of those are really the person we were trying to reach? This is the thing with clarifying who you're trying to reach is it's not about exclusivity. It's not like oh, we only want to reach this person, so we're going to ignore everybody else. But it does help you really design what you're doing to reach the person you think you can serve really well, or in a church's case, the person that you believe God's really uniquely positioned your church to serve really well. So yeah, we're measuring things at different points along that journey, but what they tell us depends on the whole picture.
Sure. And churches can relate a lot to what that whole process you just shared, because it's very similar, right? That somebody makes themselves known because they
Yep.
engage with something, they ask for more, and they take a
Mm-hmm.
step, and and then we can help connect them and continue their journey to follow Jesus. That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Well, one of the things that has been a big conversation, and some of that was like when COVID-19 hit and churches could only go online. Most churches I talked to, it was booming, right? Even surveys, studies that Barna did, it was like, oh wow, we're getting more people online. Like however we measure it, feels like we're getting more views online than we were in person, which is probably true, because the average person church, if most people were coming once every 3 or 4 weeks, well, yeah, if you get them all watching, even if you only get
Right.
2/3 of them watching online at one time, it's going to be more people. But then my experience too was that faded. Like Easter was great, and then it was downhill. And the big question was like online engagement. Like while our church still can't meet in person, how do we engage people online? And the smart churches, I think, are still asking that question because they know they should be doing this forever, regardless if they're meeting in person or not. But you've talked about 2 different types of online engagement. So I'd love for you to talk about those different types and where churches maybe are missing it.
Sure. Yeah. When I think about what I saw a lot in those early weeks, it was like church moved everything they were doing in the building online into the public space. And they just were speaking to their people, but in front of everybody. It was like having these intimate conversations with a room full of people who don't know. So when I think about 2 types of engagement, that's mainly, we think about insiders and outsiders. And you need, when you're thinking about your digital strategy, you need to be thinking about both groups, and you may want to engage both groups completely differently. If it were me, I would not have insider messages on a public Facebook page. I would keep that focused on content that's going to hit felt needs of the person that you're trying to reach, stuff that your people can share, stuff that celebrates the life of the community that you're in, that really celebrates the city and the people and the unique position your church has in it. I would have a private Facebook group for church members. And that's where you're talking about vision and mission, and you're encouraging people to pray, and you're, all of those church family messages. I would keep that in a church family channel. That's just one example. Email list.
Let me pause there for a second, because that's actually, I've encouraged churches to have Facebook groups, and it's not like this is some big thing for me, but when I talk to people like you who do this well, they're just talking about Facebook groups. And I know personally that Facebook groups, that's what Facebook likes. So there's way better engagement there. But when you just said that, kind of a light bulb went off in my head. If we did that, and we had a Facebook group for people who are kind of our part of the church, and then let the page be more the front facing, in some ways that's a win for both, because the group gets more engagement anyway, right? If that's what you want from your people. And the front facing part, your page, is where visitors are going to see. So we want to help them there. That makes a lot of sense to kind of split them over those 2 channels. And there's crossover, but that makes a ton of sense. That's a good idea.
Right. Yeah. And I was talking to a pastor the other day about Facebook. You basically can't get organic page post content in front of anybody unless you're going to pay for it. Yeah. With groups, what you post is going to reach the people who are part of that group. As far as your messages that you post on Facebook, reaching the people you want them to reach, groups are absolutely a strategy you should be leaning into. Another example, 2 types of engagement would be even just your website. Thinking about your website as the front door. This is the first place somebody's going to go if they're checking you out for the first time. It doesn't need to be completely full and highlighting all of your denominational beliefs and your creed and all of this. Most church websites are just full of insider messaging all over the front page, and it's really the front door. The other one I was going to mention a second ago is email. I have not come across, in all of the conversations I've had since all of this started, I have not come across more than a handful of churches that are using email the way a business or a nonprofit would use email, by having different lists that are tailored to different segments of your congregation, and having, strategies for making sure you've got some reason why people should tell you who they are, offering them some sort of content or some sort of reason to stop being anonymous. In general, social media, I think most of the social media should be more public, outside facing in content. And a lot of your internal stuff could be more like apps. I think about my church uses GroupMe on one of my serving teams. That's one of the most up-to-date, one of the places I get the most information, the quickest from in relationship with other people. There's just a lot of different ways we could be thinking about it. But if you start with two types of engagements, where there's outsider, there's insider, and then you take a step back and look at everything you're doing, going, wow, are we putting all of our insider messages in all of these outsider spaces? Or do we even have an outside, do we have any strategy whatsoever to focus on outsiders online? And then the flip side, do we have insider strategies to help people grow in discipleship? Are we thinking about how we leverage technology in different ways for the different groups of people?
Yeah, definitely. And I think most churches, again, a lot of church leaders I talked to after going online only, after COVID-19 shut things down, a lot of the stories were that there were guests, I would call them, watching online. In fact, in our church, there were numerous stories of, I've invited my uncle or my neighbor or whoever forever, and they've never come, but they're watching online, right?
Yeah,
which is great. But I think what that exposed in our church, and I'm sure others, was the next steps after that weren't so ready, like you said, emailing them specifically or speaking to them in a different way. Like I know right now we're right in the middle of it. We just sent it yesterday and today. And we've done this for a while. This isn't new for us, but I think about those people when we're making this big groups push and we're targeting different groups, different segments of people for different groups. Like you're not getting that email for this group because you've been here 2+ years. You're getting it for this one because you've been here for less than 2 years and you haven't done this other thing, right? Like there's some segmenting there to try to speak to them where they are, which is probably something we need to do a lot more of, instead of, like you're saying, it's like a megaphone for just church people. Like, here's that event,
everywhere.
Here's that thing.
Same megaphone for all the church people everywhere. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk personnel. So one of the things you help churches with at the Unstuck Group is creating a strategy. And the other part of that, of course, is, okay, now if we're going to implement this strategy, who is it? Are they in the right seats on the bus? Staffing, structure, like that kind of thing. And I think churches right now are trying to figure this out, because in the time we're in, some of them are meeting in person and trying to do online the same way they did it a few months ago. And that's hard because most churches can't manage that. We had staffing restructure conversations, and we did restructure some things all the way to the leadership team level, because we knew we couldn't keep doing both the same way, but we needed to do both, right? And we're not in person yet, but we can see that, around the corner. And so what would you say in regards to building teams to execute a good digital ministry strategy? It's probably not, here, let the intern do that, keep adding that one little thing on that one person's job description that already has too much. Like, what would you say? What are you seeing? What are you recommending to churches?
Yeah, I think this is one of the questions we're getting the most often right now, because you've got a lot of church staff teams that are full of people who are hired to design in-person environments. And now there are no in-person environments, or if there are, they are vastly
20%.
Different than they were before.
Yeah, 30% of the attendance, sure. And
right.
They look different, yeah.
Yeah. So obviously you can't really execute a brand new ministry strategy with all the same people, and that gets difficult and that gets challenging to manage. The first thing that I would say is what we're encouraging churches to do is start with the leader and go from there. So leader before strategy, before structure, because you need the leader identified on your team to help you really clarify the strategy. And you've got to be clear on the strategy before you can staff it. And that's a bigger picture conversation, because you've got to find that right person. And we've been encouraging churches, if you're a larger church, probably, I don't want to say a specific, it's hard, you can't reference anything by attendance anymore, because who cares?
That's true.
It's not about attendance.
And large is relative. Like there's some areas, large could be 1,000, and in some, like when I go visit with friends in Atlanta, it's like there's like a church on every corner that's 5,000 people. Like, what is this? We don't have this in my part of the country. Yeah.
Right. But if this is one way I've heard Tony reference it. If you are a church that has a vision and aspirations to be regional, like you're going to reach and serve people in a region, you're not just like a little neighborhood church. because a neighborhood church, you're gonna reach new people by word of mouth, you know. If you're a regional church, you're, you know, multi-site, or you're serving a larger community, or even if you're a community church and you're gonna need to be able to connect with people who are not going to just drive past your, you know, your building, your facility, then you're going to need a digital marketing plan at some point going forward, at least a digital ministry strategy. And we've been encouraging that if that's where you are, then you need someone at your senior leadership table that is responsible for building and designing this strategy. Because otherwise you're going to have a pastoral leadership team making plans without the input of somebody who knows how we might actually execute this going forward. So we really think you do need somebody at that senior leadership team level that owns digital strategy, whatever you want to call them. I think we've been internally calling it director of digital ministry strategy or something like that. We've got a sample job description I can share for your watchers. But that's the first thing, is you got to identify who's going to own this. And then from there, like, give them the permission to really craft what's the strategy going to be to align with what we're trying to do as a church. And then from there, who do we need? Who can we reposition, or who can we redirect? And then where do we have complete gaps? I would say that if you follow that path, you may find you can contract out a lot of things. You're not going to be able to contract out the strategy or the management of the team, but you can contract out somebody to produce your podcast or, you know, help with videography or graphic design. There are a lot of roles you really don't have to have full-time on staff, as long as you've got the right person at the helm.
Yeah, and I think that's what the smart churches are saying. One of the videos that I did an interview with was Holly Tate at Vanderbloemen, and I know you guys are friends, and she said the exact same thing. Like, don't hire the positions like in the weeds doing it as much as the strategy person directing at the top. And so that's what they're saying churches are looking for. And it makes sense because, like you said, it's harder you can certainly hire those need positions. It's technical, it's in the weeds, and that'll feel like you're solving a problem or whatever, but it's not really a strategy, and it's not being talked about or represented at the leadership team level, which matters a lot. And for us, this is sort of what we did. We're contracting out. I know one of the things that's helping us is it's not even just paid contractors, you know, like that person who edits video, which we have that, but it's also like companies that have some kind of service that make it easier, and we outsource. Hey, you just do that for us. Like, it's a whole company, and it's a service they provide, and let them do that from anything from, you know, social media graphics to Google web presence. Like, there's all kinds of organizations out there that can do that kind of stuff, and that's a smart way to go. I'm just curious, are most churches thinking that before they talk to you, or are you talking them into it?
I would say I can't speak to most. The first, at least the early conversations I had, they weren't thinking senior leadership team level. They were thinking somebody on our team who reports to the leadership team. I think where I would push back against that mindset is while this person should have some expertise, probably, they need to have a ministry heart. Like, they need to understand what you're trying to do as a church. They need to understand what you're trying to do as a ministry, and the ability to craft strategy and to build teams. You don't need to hire the executor, to your point, in this senior role. And so if that's the case, I think you want them in those strategy conversations. I think you want them in that highest level management of the ministry, because ultimately, if that person isn't there, you're going to have people developing all kinds of, you know, you can throw anything out there online, and you're going to throw a lot of stuff against the wall to figure out what works. But you want to do that within reason. You want to do that within, you know, representing the ministry well, and what you're trying to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. And so I do believe you need somebody who's sitting at that leadership seat to even be able to help you filter out, no, we don't even need these 3 roles, and we've got this person has the capacity to step up to this, and we can outsource XYZ, and no, we have to own this piece in-house. I think you need that person who can really be that gate for you on how do we translate what we've been doing and chart a path forward. Yeah.
Well, I think, like I said before, I love the Unstuck Group. I think you're like my favorite organization that works with churches.
Well, thanks.
And I know that Tony and the team, they work with so many churches all the time, and most churches need to be unstuck, right? Like, I would say most churches, even if you're growing and you always hit barriers and things, or you hit
Right.
seasons like this where there's so much unpredictable and you need to change and shift, and you guys help with that. We'll link some of the helpful content in the description. The podcast that you were on that I'm sure you got a lot of calls about, because that was a great conversation. I think I listened to it 3 times in the last 5 months, just to go back to it. Some of the articles you mentioned. The other thing I'll encourage people to do is to look at what you do with Unstuck from a content marketing perspective, because you do it well. So if a church could take that same idea that like we talked about earlier and replicate in their church, they'd be doing really well. I mean, I searched something, it's probably 4 weeks ago, and related to the new digital church course that I'm doing. And sure enough, there was one of your articles that you wrote, I think, and it was tagged a certain way that actually what I searched was the tag. It wasn't just like in the content. And again, that's all nerd, website talk or whatever.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I thought, of course, they do a great job with content marketing. So of course I found this, when I searched online, which is a great thing. So I encourage people to check that out. But how else can people work with the Unstuck Group if they want to go beyond just using the free content you put out?
Sure. We've got 2 primary paths. So one would be hiring us to help you facilitate a planning process. And to circle back to where we were at the very beginning of the conversation, if you're not clear on who you are, where you're going, how you're going to get there, what your strategies are, that process is fantastic. And we've been working with over 400 churches in the last 10 years, and that process just consistently blows people away. And so if that's sort of where you are, and it's just, this whole thing feels fuzzy, even if it felt clear 9 months ago and it all feels fuzzy now, that process is a fantastic thing to engage your team in, and it will unify and align your whole team on the same path towards the same goals. If you're dealing with multi-site challenges, we've got a version of that process that's for multi-site churches. We've got a version helping churches with mergers, and we've got a version that just helps teams that are dysfunctional or underperforming or struggling. And that one going forward, Lance Witt, I don't know if you know Lance, he really designed that whole process to help teams become high performing and healthy. And it's, we were just getting it off the ground right when everybody sent their teams home.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That one, we're excited to get out to churches in the next coming months as things hopefully return to normal. On the other side, we're just launching now a much more focused leadership coaching process for pastors. And it's a start now, cancel anytime, one-on-one. There's several different layers, but you can have one-on-one leadership coaching from our team and access to all of our tools and online resources. And that will be coming out in the next few weeks.
That's great. I did 2 coaching networks through you guys, probably before it was even Unstuck, or at least one of them was. And I can't recommend it enough. I mean, it's just great. I still think back to some of those conversations, and some of it obviously is the Tony and the team and the coaches, but then some of it's just the other people, that you're in a group with. And it's like, how'd you do that? And how are you reaching first-time guests? And what are you doing after? I mean, just those conversations were super valuable. So
yeah,
when I think people to check that out.
When I think about those coaching networks, it was people always signed up for them thinking they just wanted to hear from Tony Morgan. And they always walked away from it going, wow, I just love this community of pastors that I'm now part of. So we're hoping to recreate some of that secret sauce, but with a digital delivery system that makes it more accessible to more pastors at one time.
Sure. And I know I guess both of them I did had an online thing, and it was mostly online, I guess. It'd be like 2 times online, 1 time in person. But yeah, those relationships, they still continue. I mean, there's a guy that's a pastor at a church north of me in Pennsylvania named Tom, and I'm friends with him, like on Instagram, we're connected. Yeah. I see things he shares, and it's probably been 6 years or maybe more, since we were in that group together. So that's really cool. Yeah. So people can check out theunstuckgroup.com, right? Anything else they should know?
I think that's a good starting point.
That's it. Okay, cool. Well, Tiffany, thanks for taking time to share with us.
Thanks so much.